The pulverized brick dust hung thick and acrid in Berlin's humid air on May 2, 1945. Boots crushed shattered glass and charred papers, fragments of a collapsed bureaucracy, as a German soldier navigated the skeletal remains of Alexanderplatz. Distant Soviet artillery, now a dull thrum, provided the macabre soundtrack to the Third Reich's final gasps. Amidst the twisted husks of abandoned trams and smoking craters, he saw her, emaciated, a Jewish woman in her 30s, scavenging through rubble. Her patched coat still bore the faded outline where a yellow star once resided. Their eyes met. For a frozen, agonizing moment, the world held its breath. "You come with me," he said, his hand extending. Not in an act of arrest, but an urgent, bewildering invitation, a desperate plea, or perhaps a final act of a dying world asking for one last flicker of humanity. This was Berlin, May 1945. The war was over, but the fight for survival had just begun. In a city where every brick held a whisper of terror and every shadow hid a secret unlikely paths were about to cross, a moment of desperate choice, a lifeline thrown into the abyss. But what truly lay behind such a gesture in the heart of a dying empire? Before we delve deeper, tell us in the comments, where are you watching this from today? To truly grasp the weight of that single outstretched hand, we must first peel back the layers of terror that led to this impossible moment. The outstretched hand of Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann, calloused and scarred from years of combat, hovered in the space between them. It was not an offer of comfort, nor a gesture of peace, but an imperative, loaded with an urgency that sliced through the cacophony of a city tearing itself apart. Sarah Lieberman, frozen amidst the rubble of what was once Alexanderplatz, stared at it, her own skeletal fingers instinctively curling inward. The world around them was a canvas of grey and ochre, painted with the dust of pulverized brick and the stench of decay, of burnt wood, ruptured sewers, and unburied dead. The humid Berlin air, heavy with the metallic tang of smoke, pressed down on her, a physical weight she'd grown accustomed to over years of hiding. May the 2nd, 1945. The date echoed meaninglessly in Sarah's mind. Time had ceased to be a linear progression of days and weeks. It was an eternal present of hunger, fear, and the gnawing ache for a past that could never return. Her eyes, sunken deep in her emaciated face, scanned Klaus. A German soldier. The uniform, even tattered and caked with grime, was a uniform, an instrument of the regime that had stolen everything from her, her husband, her 6-year-old daughter Miriam, lost to the gas chambers of Auschwitz in '43. The ghosts of Gestapo raids, of frantic whispers in damp cellars, of the constant chilling fear of discovery, were etched into her very being. Klaus, at 29, looked a decade older. His uniform hung loosely on his gaunt frame, and a thick layer of fine, greyish-red dust coated his field-grey tunic, his rifle, and even the stubble on his face. He hadn't slept in what felt like weeks, sustained only by the primal instinct to survive, a flickering spark amidst the overwhelming desolation. The roar of Soviet tanks and the distant thud of artillery had been his constant companions, a lullaby of annihilation that had long since numbed his senses. He had seen the horrors of the Eastern Front, the frozen wastes of Stalingrad, the systematic atrocities against Jewish civilians in Ukraine in '42. He hadn't pulled the trigger himself, but he had watched. And the memory, a festering wound in his soul, had returned to haunt him with a vengeance in these final apocalyptic days of Berlin. All the patriotic fervor, the belief in a righteous cause, had evaporated, leaving behind only ash and a profound, bone-deep weariness. He had spotted her from across a crater-pocked street, a wraith-like figure sifting through a mound of debris near the twisted skeletal remains of what was once the Knorr-Bremse building. Her coat, a tattered, ill-fitting thing, still bore the faint ghost-like imprint of the yellow star that had once been sewn onto it. A phantom brand against the fabric. Her desperation was palpable, a raw, exposed nerve in the shattered landscape. And then their eyes met. Sarah saw the weariness, the shadows of torment, but also something else, something she couldn't quite decipher. A flicker of recognition, perhaps, or a desperate plea that mirrored her own. "You come with me," Klaus repeated, his voice hoarse. Barely audible above the distant crackle of rifle fire, his hand remained extended, steady, unwavering. There was no menace in his tone, only an urgent, almost desperate conviction. The simple words, spoken in her native German, pierced through the layers of fear and distrust. Could it be a trap, another cruel game by the Gestapo who, even in their death throes, delighted in hunting down the last remaining U-boats? Her mind screamed warnings, honed by years of evasion. But her body, starved and weak, craved shelter, warmth, a momentary reprieve from the relentless cold dread. A sudden, sharp burst of machine gun fire erupted a few blocks away, closer than before, followed by the guttural shouts of men, both Russian and German. The sound, brutal and immediate, tore through her paralysis. Klaus's eyes darted towards the commotion, then back to her, a heightened urgency now etched into his features. His jaw was clenched, a muscle twitching under his gaunt cheek. He wasn't waiting for an answer. He was presenting a choice, live or die, with him or here, and the choice, in that instant, was no choice at all. Sarah nodded almost imperceptibly, a fragile motion, and took a tentative step forward. The sound of shattered glass crunching under her worn boots was deafening in the charged silence between them. Her legs, stiff and aching, protested every movement. Klaus withdrew his hand, turning instantly. "Follow me, and keep low," he commanded, his voice barely above a whisper. His gaze scanning the rubble-strewn street for any sign of movement. He moved with the practiced stealth of a predator, or perhaps a hunted animal. He led her through a labyrinth of forgotten alleyways, choked with debris and the skeletal remains of vehicles, their metal carcasses twisted into grotesque sculptures. They ducked through gaping holes in ruined buildings, navigated treacherous piles of fallen masonry, and at one point squeezed through a narrow, dark tunnel carved beneath a collapsed apartment block, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Sarah stumbled frequently, her knees threatening to buckle, her breath ragged and shallow. Each shadow seemed to lengthen into a lurking threat, each distant sound a potential executioner. She pressed on, driven by a primal instinct, a desperate hope that this might not be another path to her end. Klaus moved with an uncanny sense of the city's hidden veins, a knowledge born of fighting for survival in its dying heart. He knew which streets were likely to be patrolled by Soviet advance scouts, their victorious shouts echoing through the ruins. He knew where the last pockets of German resistance, fanatical youths and desperate old men armed with panzerfausts might still be making their suicidal stands. He avoided both with equal caution, his senses hyper-alert, his rifle clutched tight. His actions were not born of heroism, but a quiet, almost resigned defiance of the chaos. A small, solitary act of rebellion against the crushing weight of the world he had helped create. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of creeping through shadows and the debris of a fallen empire, he stopped before a partially collapsed structure, barely recognizable as a building. A rusted metal cellar door, half buried under rubble, was their entrance. With surprising strength, he pried it open, revealing a gaping maw of darkness. "Down here," he murmured, his voice strained. Sarah hesitated for a moment, peering into the inky blackness, the ancient fear of confined spaces, of being trapped, rising in her throat. But the urgency in his eyes and the distant, ever-present growl of war pushed her forward. She descended into the damp, cold darkness, the steps crumbling beneath her feet. The cellar was small, suffocating and utterly bare save for a few discarded planks of wood and the pervasive smell of mildew and earth. A sliver of light filtered in from a small, grimy window high above, revealing dust motes dancing in the heavy air. Klaus entered behind her, pushing the heavy cellar door shut, plunging them into near-total darkness. The sudden silence, broken only by their ragged breathing and the muffled distant rumbles of the city, was profound. "You'll be safe here for now," Klaus said, his voice softer, less commanding. He leaned his rifle against the damp stone wall, exhaling slowly, the tension in his shoulders visibly easing. He offered her nothing else, no explanation, no apology, no promise beyond the immediate. Sarah looked at him, her eyes struggling to adjust to the gloom. His face was a mask of exhaustion and something unreadable. Protection. From what? From whom? The questions screamed in her mind, but she dared not voice them. Fear and distrust warred with a fragile, almost incomprehensible flicker of hope. She was in a cellar again, with a German soldier in the heart of Berlin. And yet, for the first time in days, in weeks, she felt a perverse, desperate sense of not being alone. The silence stretched between them, thick with untold stories and the heavy burden of a future as uncertain as the ruins above their heads. The damp, earthy scent of the cellar enveloped Sarah, a familiar, suffocating embrace. Klaus, having secured the door, sat in the gloom against the opposite wall, his rifle still cradled loosely in his arms, his eyes fixed on the entrance. He seemed to have forgotten her presence, lost in the grim vigilance of a soldier on watch. But Sarah could not forget his. She sat on the cold, packed earth, knees drawn to her chest, the chill seeping into her bones. The frantic rush through the ruins had momentarily silenced the screaming voices in her head, the constant chorus of fear and loss. Now, in the relative quiet of the subterranean space, they surged back, a relentless tide of memories. A sharp, almost physical pain lanced through her chest, a phantom echo of the day her world shattered. 1943. A train. The cattle car, crammed with too many bodies, too little air, the screams of children, the bewildered faces of the old. Her husband David, his hand tight in hers, his eyes silently pleading for a strength she didn't possess. Miriam, her sweet Miriam, just 6 years old, clutching her beloved wooden doll, her small face streaked with tears, asking, "Mama, where are we going?" Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, trying to banish the image, but it was burned onto the inside of her eyelids. Auschwitz. The name, a guttural whisper of damnation, resonated in the dark. She remembered the separation, the brutality, the final agonizing glance across a sea of terrified faces, seeing David and Miriam dragged away. She had been deemed fit for labor, a cruel twist of fate that ensured her survival while condemning them to oblivion. The guilt was a heavy cloak she had worn ever since, heavier than any patched coat. But from that profound, soul-crushing loss, a fierce, unyielding will to survive had blossomed, a promise to Miriam, unspoken but deeply felt. "I will live for you. I will bear witness." It had propelled her out of the camps, an impossible escape during a chaotic transfer, a blur of barbed wire, dark forest, and the echoing crack of rifles. She remembered the desperate trek back to Berlin, a city she once called home, now a trap. Her life since then had been a subterranean existence, a constant dance with death, relying on the extraordinary courage of ordinary Germans. She saw their faces now in the gloom, the elderly baker, Herr Schmidt, who had hidden her in his flour-dusted pantry for weeks, sharing his meager rations. His eyes always wary but kind. The young seamstress, Frau Lehner, who'd risked her family's life to give Sarah a false identity card, flimsy and terrifyingly real, each face a beacon of defiant humanity in a world consumed by darkness. Then Margaret Hartmann, a warmth, fleeting and bittersweet, spread through Sarah's cold limbs at the memory. From November 1944 to January 1945, Margarete, Klaus's mother, had offered her sanctuary in her small, damaged apartment in Prenzlauer Berg. It was a haven of sorts, a reprieve from the constant cold and hunger. Margarete, a widow with the quiet strength of a woman who had seen too much war, had shared her food, her stories, and a silent, empathetic understanding. Sarah remembered the smell of old lace and brewing ersatz coffee, the soft murmur of Margarete's voice as she read from a worn Bible, the desperate hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this might be a place of enduring safety. But safety was an illusion. The Gestapo, ever present, ever vigilant, were like bloodhounds. Hauptsturmführer SS Werner Kessler, the name a cold shard of ice in her memory, was the architect of that constant dread. A zealous hunter of U-boats, Kessler was a ghost that haunted her waking hours and her nightmares. He was a man driven by an ideological fanaticism that intensified even as the Reich crumbled around him. He refused to accept defeat, relentlessly pursuing his grim mission to complete the work. Sarah remembered the sound of heavy boots on the stairs of Margarete's building. The sudden, frantic whisper, "They're here, Gestapo!" Margarete's face pale with terror, her hands trembling as she pushed Sarah towards a hidden compartment behind a loose floorboard, the metallic tang of fear in the air, the pounding of her own heart in her ears. She had barely squeezed into the cramped, dust-filled space when the door burst open. She heard Kessler's voice, sharp and authoritative, his questions laced with menace. She heard Margarete's strained answers, her denials, the search, slow and methodical, the thud of objects being tossed, furniture scraped across the floor above her head. She held her breath, every muscle screaming with tension, convinced this was the end. After what felt like an eternity, the boots receded, the door slammed shut. She had escaped, but the memory was a fresh wound, a stark reminder of the knife edge on which she lived. She had fled Margarete's, not wanting to put the brave woman in further danger, disappearing back into the labyrinthine alleys of Berlin. She remembered Rachel Goldstein, a younger woman, spirited and resilient, with whom she had shared several hiding places in 1944. Rachel had become like a daughter, a beacon of youthful defiance in a world intent on extinguishing it. They had been separated in February 1945 during one of the ceaseless Allied bombing raids, a chaos of fire and falling masonry. Sarah prayed Rachel had found safety, and Dr. Friedrich Adler, the retired physician, a man of quiet dignity and immense courage, who had harbored them both for 6 weeks in the autumn of 1944 in an abandoned clinic, his trembling hands administering what meager medical care he could, his eyes, weary but kind, conveying a silent condemnation of the regime he despised. Where were they now? Were they alive? Her thoughts drifted back to Klaus, a German soldier, a uniform. He had served the very machine that sought her extermination. The uniform itself was a symbol of oppression, of unimaginable cruelty. Yet he had saved her. He had offered a hand, a shelter, a moment of respite. Was it a trap? A cruel delay of the inevitable? Or was there a sliver of genuine humanity beneath the hardened exterior, a conscience stirring in the ruins of their shared world? The instinct for survival, honed by years of relentless persecution, screamed at her to trust no one, least of all a soldier of the Reich. Yet the absolute exhaustion, the gnawing hunger, the profound relief of escaping the immediate apocalyptic chaos of Alexanderplatz chipped away at her ingrained paranoia. She glanced at him in the dim light. His eyes, though weary, were still alert, scanning the door. He was protecting her for now, but his intentions remained shrouded in the shadows, as elusive and unsettling as the faint, distant echoes of the dying war. The silence of the cellar was a fragile truce, a temporary pause in a life lived on the run, a place where the shadows of her past converged with the terrifying uncertainty of her present. Klaus sat in the gloom of the cellar, the rhythmic thud of his own heart a counterpoint to the distant echoes of a dying city. His grip on his rifle tightened, not out of fear for an immediate threat, but from an ingrained habit forged in the crucible of war. He was accustomed to darkness, to silence, to the gnawing uncertainty of what lay beyond the next shattered wall. But the presence of the woman, Sarah, a quiet, almost spectral figure huddled in the corner, introduced a new, unsettling element to his fractured reality. Her existence here, in this temporary sanctuary, was an act of defiance, a silent accusation against everything he had once believed in, everything he had fought for. His mind, exhausted and frayed, drifted back, unbidden, to the frozen hellscapes of the Eastern Front. Russia, 1941. The initial euphoria of the invasion, the relentless push eastward, quickly replaced by the brutal reality of scorched earth, endless forests, and an enemy that refused to break. He remembered Stalingrad, a name that tasted like ash and iron on his tongue. The ceaseless shelling, the desperate house-to-house fighting, the comrades freezing to death in their foxholes, their eyes wide with terror and disbelief. He'd been lucky, a piece of shrapnel in his thigh, sending him back to a field hospital, a reprieve from the meat grinder. But the physical wound had healed far quicker than the invisible scars etched upon his soul. He saw the faces again, the ones that haunted his nightmares. Not the enemy soldiers, but the civilians. Ukraine, 1942. His unit had been moving through a small village, the air already thick with the smell of wood smoke and terror. He remembered the Einsatzgruppen, the special SS units, their grim efficiency, their cold, dispassionate cruelty. He had seen the lines of people, mostly women and children, forced to dig their own graves before being shot. He hadn't participated. He had merely watched, paralyzed by a mixture of shock, fear, and a burgeoning, sickening horror. He remembered turning away, his stomach churning, the metallic taste of bile rising in his throat. His comrades, too, had averted their gaze, some hardened, others merely stunned into silence. Back then they'd whispered about resettlement and partisan cleanup, the flimsy justifications offered by their superiors. But the images were too vivid, too grotesque to be explained away by propaganda. He had known, even then, that something monstrous was unfolding, and he had done nothing. His return to Berlin in March 1945, after months of recovery, had been a stark awakening. He had left a city simmering with purpose, however misguided. He returned to a city collapsing inward, its grand boulevards reduced to rubble, its citizens gaunt and hollow-eyed, its spirit broken. The regime, once an unyielding edifice of power, was now a fractured, desperate thing, its leaders hiding in bunkers, sending boys and old men to die on the barricades. He thought of Heinrich Becker, his comrade, a cynical unteroffizier with a permanent sneer and a leg wound from the battle for Berlin that still seeped. Becker had seen too much, done too much to believe in anything anymore. "We were fools, Klaus," Becker had rasped days earlier, huddled in a makeshift bunker under a bombed-out department store. "All of us believed the lies, fought for ghosts. Now look at us, beggars in our own city, waiting for the Russians to pick over the bones." There was no fire in Becker's words, only a profound, weary resignation. And then there was Lieutenant Martin Schneider, a young officer barely out of his teens, a product of a traditional Prussian family, raised on tales of duty and honor. Martin had joined the Wehrmacht with an idealism that even then Klaus had found unsettlingly naive. In the chaos of these final days, Klaus had seen the idealism drain from Martin's eyes, replaced by a raw, disbelieving terror. Just yesterday, during a desperate counterattack near the Reichstag, Martin had frozen. his orders dying on his lips as he watched a civilian woman caught in the crossfire. "What are we doing, Klaus?" Martin had whispered later, his face streaked with tears, his voice trembling. "This isn't war. This is madness. For what?" The young lieutenant had started to question, for the first time in his life, the very fabric of his existence. He represented a generation forced to mature brutally, to confront the unspeakable truths hidden beneath decades of carefully constructed lies. These conversations, fragments of despair and disillusionment, mirrored Klaus's own internal disintegration. He had served the Wehrmacht with a sense of duty, a belief in protecting his homeland. But the homeland had become a grotesque parody of itself, and the protection had morphed into complicity in unspeakable crimes. The images from Ukraine, the faces of the condemned, had never truly left him. They had festered, a slow poison, until the collapse of Berlin ripped open the old wounds, exposing the raw nerve of his conscience. His gaze flickered to Sarah again. Why had he offered his hand? The question hung heavy in the stale air. It wasn't a calculated decision. It was an instinct, raw and visceral. A late, desperate act of humanity, perhaps, a subconscious attempt at expiation for the horrors he had witnessed, for the complicity of his silence. He was a soldier of a defeated, disgraced army, his uniform meaningless, his loyalty shattered. The old categories, the old hatreds, suddenly seemed absurd, irrelevant in the face of such absolute destruction. She was a human being, starving, hunted, terrified, and he, for a fleeting moment, was simply a human being, witnessing her suffering. The pragmatic part of his mind also whispered that old loyalties were now dangerous. The SS would kill him for helping her. The Soviets might shoot him regardless. But what did it matter? The world was ending. A new thought, both terrifying and resolute, solidified in his mind. He couldn't just leave her here, in this temporary hole in the ground. She was alone, vulnerable. But he knew someone who might help, someone who had already helped her before. His mother, Margaret. He remembered Margaret's quiet strength, her steady gaze, the way she had spoken of the war with a weary disdain even years ago. He knew she had sheltered Sarah before, a secret act of defiance that had cemented his mother's courage in his mind. She would know what to do. She would know how to protect her. The thought brought a strange mix of dread and purpose. Taking Sarah to Margaret's apartment in Prenzlauer Berg would be a treacherous journey across a city still swarming with dangers, Soviet patrols, desperate German holdouts, and worst of all, the vengeful remnants of the Gestapo still hunting their prey. He straightened slightly, his eyes still fixed on the cellar door, but his mind already tracing a new path through the ruined city. He had to get her to his mother. It was a perilous decision, a new burden he was willingly taking on. But in the utter collapse of his world, this single, desperate act of protection, this small flicker of human connection, felt like the only thing left that still made any sense. The shadows in the cellar deepened, mirroring the grim resolve forming in Klaus Hartmann's eyes. The journey to his mother's apartment would be another trial by fire, a desperate dash through the heart of the inferno. And he knew, with chilling certainty, that it was a journey from which there might be no return for either of them. The official capitulation of Berlin on May 2, 1945, was less a clean end than a transition into a new, more unpredictable form of chaos. The air, still thick with the residue of pulverized masonry, now also carried the metallic scent of exhaustion and the pungent odor of fear. For Hauptsturmführer SS Werner Kessler, however, the war was far from over. His gaunt face, usually composed, now twitched with a manic intensity. The defeat of the Wehrmacht, the ignominious end of the Führer, meant nothing to him. His mission, distilled to a chilling purity, remained the same: to purge. The internal enemies, The hidden Jews were to be eliminated at all costs, even if he had to drag them from the very ashes of the Reich personally. With a small, desperate cadre of loyal SS men, equally deranged by fanaticism or fear of reprisal, Kessler prowled the ruined streets, a ghost of a dying ideology, a predator refusing to acknowledge the hunt was over. Meanwhile, Klaus, guided by an almost supernatural instinct for avoiding both the victorious Soviets and the scattered, suicidal pockets of German resistance, navigated the ruined city with Sarah. Their journey from the Alexanderplatz cellar to Prenzlauer Berg was a crawl through a dystopian landscape. They moved under the cloak of twilight, keeping to the shadows of bombed-out buildings, their steps muted by shattered glass and fallen debris. Sarah, despite her profound weakness, found her reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, her fear a constant, bitter fuel. Klaus, ever vigilant, scanned every window, every alleyway, his rifle held ready, his senses sharpened by years of combat. He was no longer a soldier fighting for a cause. He was a guide, a silent protector. The apartment building in Prenzlauer Berg was partially intact, a testament to its sturdy pre-war construction. The stairs were steep, littered with rubble, the air within, smelling faintly of dust and damp plaster. Klaus led Sarah through the damaged entryway, past splintered doors, and up 2 flights of creaking stairs to Margaret's apartment. He knocked softly, a coded rhythm that Margaret would recognize. The door opened a crack, revealing Margaret's face etched with worry lines, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. When she saw Klaus, a gasp escaped her lips, quickly followed by a rush of relief, but then her gaze fell upon Sarah, huddled behind him in the dim light. Margaret's face, already pale, lost what little color it had. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice a fragile breath. The name was a prayer, a plea, a recognition. Sarah, seeing the familiar, kind face of Margaret, felt a wave of profound, aching relief wash over her, momentarily eclipsing the constant thrum of fear. She stepped forward, her body trembling, and Margaret, without a word, pulled her into a tight embrace. It was a bittersweet reunion, a moment suspended between the joy of survival and the crushing weight of everything they had lost. Margaret's arms were thin, her body weary, but the strength of her embrace spoke volumes. "My dear girl," she murmured, tears welling in her eyes, "you're alive." Klaus watched them, a strange knot in his stomach. The raw emotion, the undeniable connection between these 2 women was a stark contrast to the brutal detachment he had cultivated over years of war. He felt a flicker of something akin to pride for his mother, for her unwavering courage. Margaret, pulling back, her eyes still red-rimmed, looked at Klaus, a silent question passing between them. He simply nodded, a confirmation of the unspoken danger, the precariousness of Sarah's presence. "She needs shelter, Mutter, and food." Margaret, despite her exhaustion, nodded. "Of course, Klaus, always." Her gaze, however, conveyed a deeper truth. The renewed risk, the burden they were all now sharing. "I need to find supplies," Klaus stated, his voice low. "Water, anything edible. It won't be safe for long." He knew he couldn't stay. His uniform, even stripped of its insignia, was a magnet for trouble, and 3 people together were a larger target. Leaving them was a torment, but staying would be a foolish gamble. He gave his mother a quick, meaningful glance, a silent instruction to be careful, and then, with a heavy heart, he was gone, melting back into the urban labyrinth. As Klaus ventured out, deep within another part of Berlin, a fragile figure emerged from a collapsed church crypt, her eyes blinking against the harsh grey light. Rachel Goldstein, fueled by a desperate hope and the unwavering belief that Sarah was still alive, had decided she could no longer remain hidden. The crypt had become a tomb, the dwindling supplies barely enough to sustain her. She had heard the distant shouts of "capitulation!" and knew the world had changed, for better or worse. Her heart hammered with a desperate resolve. She needed to find Sarah, her only family left in this shattered city. She clutched a tattered map of Berlin, scrawled with crude marks indicating potential safe houses and former Jewish neighborhoods, places Sarah might seek refuge. Her journey through the devastated streets was a terrifying ordeal. Starving civilians scavenged like ghosts. Soviet soldiers, some drunk, others grimly efficient, patrolled the intersections. And then she saw them. A squad of SS men, their black uniforms incongruous against the backdrop of ruin, moving with a disturbing purposefulness. At their head, a man with a cold, almost predatory gaze. Kessler. Rachel froze, pressing herself against the wet stone of a crumbling wall, her breath catching in her throat. They were checking papers, questioning passers-by, their movements radiating menace. A young woman, clutching a bundle, was roughly interrogated, her pleas ignored. Rachel watched, paralyzed, as one of Kessler's men, a brutish Oberscharführer with a scarred face, turned suddenly, his eyes sweeping over the shadows where she hid. He paused, his gaze narrowing. Rachel knew with a sickening certainty that he had seen something. She bolted, running with the desperate speed of a hunted animal, the shouts of the SS men echoing behind her. She plunged into a narrow, unlit alleyway, disappearing into the darkness, just as a bullet ricocheted off the wall where she had been standing. Kessler's relentless hunt continued, even as his world crumbled. Klaus, meanwhile, experienced the bitter reality of liberation. The main thoroughfares were now choked with Soviet troops, their trucks rumbling through the ruins, their soldiers, a mix of weary veterans and eager young recruits, celebrating their victory with an unsettling blend of revelry and ruthlessness. He witnessed the casual brutality against German civilians, men dragged from their homes, women cornered in alleyways. The joyous shouts of "Urra" were often followed by screams. He had to shed the last vestiges of his uniform, tearing off his tunic, pulling a civilian jacket he'd scavenged over his field-grey shirt. His military bearing, once a source of pride, now marked him as a target. He used every ounce of his combat experience to become invisible, melting into the throngs of terrified civilians, knowing when to run, when to hide, when to simply stand still and blend in. He scavenged what he could, a dented pot, a few stale crusts of bread, a bottle of murky water, his mind racing, obsessed with getting back to Margaret and Sarah. Unbeknownst to him, Kessler, having narrowly missed Rachel, shifted his focus. An informant, a terrified civilian, desperate to curry favor in the new, unstable order, had whispered rumors of Jewish U-boats in the Prenzlauer Berg district, protected by traitors. The information was vague, but for Kessler it was enough. The district, once familiar, was now a maze of shattered streets and collapsed buildings, but he knew its heart. He directed his men, his eyes alight with a cold, murderous zeal, towards Prenzlauer Berg. The net, invisible but tightening, was drawing closer around Margaretta's apartment. The precarious sanctuary of Sarah and Margaret and the desperate journey of Klaus were about to collide with the relentless final hunt of a man who refused to let his hateful ideology die with the Reich. The silence of their apartment was a fragile shield, about to be shattered by the approaching storm. The metallic tang of smoke and the coppery scent of fresh blood now mingled with the acrid dust in the air of Prenzlauer Berg. Hauptsturmführer SS Werner Kessler, his eyes alight with a cold, almost deranged conviction, stood before Margaret Hartmann's apartment door. The informant, a sniveling, desperate man, had proven useful. Rumors of Jewish U-boats in this district, protected by traitors, had led Kessler and his two remaining fanatics through the labyrinth of ruins, their boots crunching on glass, their faces grim and unyielding. The war might be lost, but for Kessler, the final solution was an eternal mandate. He pounded on the door, a series of sharp, Brutal raps that echoed through the strained silence of the building. Inside, Sarah and Margaret froze. The soft murmur of Margaret's voice, offering a meager portion of ersatz coffee, died on her lips. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, a terrifying drumbeat. The Gestapo. They had found her. Again. Margaret, despite the tremor in her hands, moved with a surprising resolve, pushing Sarah towards the old hidden compartment behind the loose floorboard, the same one Sarah had used months ago. "Quickly!" she whispered, her voice tight with fear, but her eyes resolute. The pounding intensified, now accompanied by a guttural shout, "Open up, Gestapo!" Just as Margaret was about to deny entry, the sound of scrambling on the stairs, then a familiar, low growl. Klaus. He had been navigating the perilous streets, a heavy sack of scavenged goods clutched in one hand, his rifle in the other, when he heard the shouts. His heart had lurched. He knew that voice. Kessler. He knew that apartment. His mother's. Klaus burst onto the landing just as one of Kessler's SS men was raising his boot to kick in the door. The SS man, a brutish Oberscharführer with a scarred face, turned, his eyes widening in surprise. Klaus didn't hesitate. His rifle butt cracked against the Oberscharführer's temple, sending him sprawling with a choked cry. Kessler spun around, his hand flying to his holstered Luger. "Hartmann! Traitor!" he snarled, recognizing Klaus's Wehrmacht uniform even beneath the civilian jacket, his face contorted in a mask of fury. "You aid a Jewess. You betray the Reich." "The Reich is dead, Kessler," Klaus spat, his own rifle now leveled, the familiar weight a cold comfort in his hands. "You're a ghost hunting shadows." A shot rang out, not from Kessler but from his remaining SS man, a young fanatic whose eyes burned with unwavering loyalty. The bullet whizzed past Klaus's ear, embedding itself in the plaster wall. Klaus returned fire, a single, precise shot that took the fanatic in the chest. He crumpled, a surprised look on his face. Kessler, enraged, lunged, his Luger barking. Klaus dodged, returning fire. The landing became a scene of brutal, desperate combat, two figures locked in a dance of death amidst the peeling wallpaper and shattered light fixtures. The sounds of the struggle, the gunshots, echoed through the ruined building, a violent intrusion into the precarious silence of the post-war city. Suddenly, another figure stumbled up the stairs, limping heavily. It was Unter a Fischer. Heinrich Becker, his leg wound still bleeding, his face grim. He had been making his way towards Klaus's general vicinity, hoping to find a familiar face, drawn by the distant sounds of gunfire. When he saw Kessler, the face of fanaticism he had come to despise, and Klaus fighting against him, something in Becker snapped. The cynicism, the weary resignation, dissolved into a raw, righteous anger. He raised his own scavenged rifle, its stock cracked and fired. The shot, wild and off-target, still served its purpose, distracting Kessler for a critical moment. From another stairwell, a third figure emerged, younger, less hardened, but with a newfound steel in his eyes, Lieutenant Martin Schneider. He had been separated from his unit, adrift in the chaos, grappling with the profound disillusionment of his beliefs. He had been looking for Klaus, for some anchor in the storm. Seeing his superior officer, Klaus, fighting against the last vestiges of the SS, solidified Martin's own refusal to follow the insane orders of a dying regime. He ran forward, not with a weapon, but with a desperate resolve, tackling Kessler from behind, bringing the fanatical SS officer crashing to the ground. Kessler struggled, snarling, but Klaus, seizing the opportunity, brought the butt of his rifle down with bone-jarring force. A sickening crack. Kessler went limp, his Luger clattering across the floor. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by their ragged breathing and the distant rumble of Soviet tanks. Margaret, peering through the cracked door, her face tear-streaked, rushed out to tend to Klaus, checking for injuries. He waved her off, his eyes scanning the landing. Becker leaned heavily against the wall, his wounded leg throbbing, a grim satisfaction on his face. Martin, shaken but resolute, stood over Kessler's unconscious form. The immediate threat was neutralized. Just then, from the street below, a new sound began to grow. The rumbling of heavy vehicles, the murmur of Russian voices, closer than before. The gunshots had attracted attention. A moment later, a figure emerged from the shadows of a nearby building, drawn by the commotion. Rachel Goldstein, her face streaked with dirt and tears, her eyes wide with fear and desperate hope. She had heard the gunfire, had been running towards it, a desperate gamble that it might lead her to Sarah. Her gaze fell upon Sarah, who had now emerged from the apartment, trembling but alive, clutching Margaret's hand. "Sarah!" Rachel cried, a raw, joyous sound that echoed in the shattered quiet. She launched herself forward, stumbling over rubble, and collapsed into Sarah's arms. It was a reunion born of suffering and unimaginable loss, a fragile bloom of hope amidst the wreckage. They held each other, two survivors clinging to the last threads of their shared humanity. The heavy footsteps on the stairs announced their arrival. Soviet soldiers, grim-faced and heavily armed, poured onto the landing, their submachine guns raised. At their head stood Major Alexei Volkov, a man of 31 with sharp, intelligent eyes, his NKVD uniform immaculate despite the chaos. He surveyed the scene, the dead SS men, the unconscious Kessler, the 3 German soldiers, 1 wounded, and the 2 Jewish women, one clearly a survivor of the camps. His gaze, piercing and complex, settled first on Klaus, then on Sarah and Rachel. Volkov spoke in crisp German, his accent precise. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice devoid of emotion. The interrogation was swift, tense. Klaus, Margaret, and Sarah recounted their story, each fragment adding to the harrowing tapestry. Volkov listened, his expression unreadable, occasionally interrupting with a sharp, probing question. When Sarah spoke of Kessler, of his relentless hunt, of the fate of her family, a flicker of something raw, pain, recognition, perhaps even vengeance, crossed Volkov's features. He was a Jew from Ukraine, his own family lost to the massacres of Babi Yar. He knew the depths of Kessler's ideology. He looked at Kessler's unconscious form, then back at Klaus, Becker, and Schneider, a strange calculation in his eyes. Klaus, a former Wehrmacht soldier, had just saved a Jewish woman from an SS fanatic. The irony was not lost on Volkov. He was a liberator, yes, but also an occupier, tasked with establishing order, punishing war criminals, but also, in his heart, seeking a measure of justice for his own profound loss. He saw in Sarah and Rachel not just survivors, but witnesses. And in Klaus, he saw a complex figure, a former enemy, but one who had, in the dying moments of the Reich, made a choice that transcended the brutal loyalties of war. He did not formally punish Klaus nor his comrades, a silent acknowledgement of their intervention. Instead, he ordered Kessler to be taken, along with his dead men, and made arrangements for Sarah and Rachel to be provided with initial care and registration as displaced persons. The support was precarious, the new order still in flux, but it was real. As the Soviet soldiers led Kessler away, his eyes still holding a spark of defiant hatred even in unconsciousness, Klaus stood by the shattered window of Margaret's apartment, his mother by his side, Rachel and Sarah a little further back, their hands still clasped. Outside, Berlin stretched before them, a panorama of ruin and desolation. Buildings were hollowed-out shells, monuments to the madness that had consumed them. The faint sound of artillery fire had ceased, replaced by the constant hum of Soviet vehicles and the distant mournful cries of a city beginning to process its trauma. Klaus looked at the shattered skyline, then at Sarah. His past, laden with the weight of participation and inaction, would forever be etched into his soul. His future was uncertain, a blank canvas of ashes and rubble. But in this moment, a tiny, resilient seed of hope had taken root. Humanity, in its most desperate hour, had prevailed over horror, leaving behind a legacy of unspeakable scars and a long, tortuous path towards reconstruction. The journey was far from over for any of them. But in the ruins of Berlin, they had found each other, survivors standing on the precipice of a new, uncertain dawn. The dust of a defeated empire settled over Berlin, but in Margareta Hartmann's apartment, a different kind of calm descended. The final, desperate hunt of Hauptsturmführer SS Werner Kessler, a relic of a dying ideology, had met its end not on a battlefield, but in a tense, brutal confrontation on a humble stairwell. It was a climax forged by unexpected acts of defiance. Klaus Hartmann, the weary soldier, choosing humanity over dogma. Heinrich Becker, the cynical veteran finding a late moral compass, and Martin Schneider, the disillusioned idealist, finally refusing to follow madness. In the immediate aftermath, amidst the echoing silence, Rachel Goldstein found Sarah, a reunion that spoke volumes of loss, resilience, and the enduring power of connection. Major Alexei Volkov, the liberator with the scars of his own past, arrived to dissect the scene, his justice complex yet profound. He saw not just Germans and Jews, but survivors and perpetrators, caught in the crucible of history. Kessler, the hunter, was now the captured, his hateful mission finally irrevocably thwarted. Sarah and Rachel, though bearing wounds that would never fully heal, found a precarious foothold in a new, uncertain world. Klaus, no longer defined solely by his uniform, faced a future intertwined with the ghosts of his past, his actions a testament to the individual's capacity for change, even in the face of overwhelming darkness. Berlin, a monument to destruction and resilience, continued to smolder. Its scarred skyline was a canvas of human suffering, but also a silent promise of rebirth. This chapter, like so many untold, reminds us that even in the most catastrophic failures of humanity, courage can ignite in the unlikeliest of souls, weaving threads of hope into the tapestry of despair. It is a testament to the enduring human spirit, a beacon against the overwhelming shadows of war, proving that even when all seems lost, the choice to act, to protect, to remember, can redefine destiny. Consider the choices made by Klaus, Becker, and Schneider. Faced with overwhelming evil and the collapse of their world, they chose defiance. What act of courage, however small, do you believe would have held the most meaning in a city consumed by such darkness? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this chronicle of resilience and moral courage moved you, explore another harrowing tale from the ashes of conflict in our next video. And if you wish to delve deeper into these crucial fragments of history, remember to like this video and subscribe to WWII Lost Stories. Your engagement helps ensure these voices are never forgotten.